I'm 41 years old and I haven't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 8 months. My name is Elena Costas, and for 3 days in March I kept something alive in my bathtub that I still don't have a name for. I found it half buried in the sand during an unusual low tide, barely breathing, its skin translucent enough that I could see the pulse beneath. I brought it home. I fed it. I watched it grow stronger. And on the third night, when the tide rose 6 feet higher than any forecast predicted, I learned that rescue was never what I'd been doing. I'd been holding something while its family decided whether I was worth leaving alive. I'm telling this now because last week I found another one. This time, I didn't touch it. This time, I understood what the 3 days had actually been for. The intertidal zone is neither land nor sea. Twice a day it transforms completely, submerged, then exposed, then submerged again. Marine biologists call it one of the harshest environments on Earth. Everything that lives there has adapted to exist in two worlds simultaneously, to survive being neither fully one thing nor another. It's also where the ocean leaves its secrets. Beachcombers know this. People who walk coastlines at dawn or during unusual tides develop an eye for what doesn't belong. Most of what they find has explanations. Deep sea fish displaced by storms, juvenile creatures separated from their pods, transparent larval stages of common species that look alien until you know what you're seeing. But occasionally something surfaces that resists identification. The Montauk Monster in 2008, the St. Augustine Globster in 1896. Dozens of others, photographed and puzzled over, eventually explained or quietly forgotten. The liminal zone reveals things that don't survive classification. There's a particular psychology that develops in people who walk beaches alone. They begin to feel ownership over their stretch of coastline, responsibility for what washes up. When they find something injured or stranded, the first instinct isn't to call authorities. It's to help first, to understand what they're looking at, to make a decision from knowledge rather than panic. Wildlife rehabilitation experts confirm this pattern. People hide injured animals regularly. They fear that calling professionals means euthanasia or confiscation. They convince themselves they can research what to do, that they can be the one who saves it. And when what they've found doesn't match anything in their research, the secrecy deepens, not from malice, from the absolute certainty that no one will believe them, that they'll be dismissed or ridiculed, that speaking aloud will somehow make the impossible thing vanish. Folklore understands this better than science does. Coastal communities across every continent share stories about the things left behind when the tide retreats. In Scottish tradition, selkies, seal folk who shed their skins, supposedly leave their young in protected caves during certain seasons, trusting the tide to guard them. Pacific Island cultures describe fish people who deposit their offspring in warm shallows while the adults hunt in deeper waters. Japanese Ningyo legends speak of creatures neither fish nor human that appear in tide pools, watching humans with unsettling intelligence. The consistent detail across these unconnected traditions is vulnerability. Merfolk young are described as more fragile than adults, sometimes unable to survive in deep water yet, requiring the liminal zone for reasons the stories don't explain. And the second consistent detail is the prohibition. Interfering with these creatures brings consequences. The ocean reclaims what belongs to it, always. But prohibition only works if people believe the stories. Elena Costas walked the same stretch of Washington coastline every morning before work, 2 miles from her house to the lighthouse and back. She'd been doing it for 7 years, since the divorce, since she'd needed something structurally sound to build her days around. She knew the rhythm of that beach the way you know your own breathing. She knew what belonged and what didn't. The tide that morning was lower than she'd ever seen it. The forecast had predicted a minus tide, common enough in early spring, but this was something else. Sections of seafloor that she'd never seen exposed lay slick and gleaming in the early light. Tide pools that were normally knee-deep had become shallow depressions. The waterline had receded so far that the sounds were wrong, no waves breaking. Just the distant whisper of ocean pulled back like an inhale before speaking. She should have turned around. People who study tsunamis will tell you that the ocean pulls back before the wave comes. It's not a metaphor. The water actually retreats, exposing seafloor, creating an eerie silence, and that silence should send every creature running inland. But Elena wasn't thinking about tsunamis. She was thinking that she had maybe an hour before the tide returned, and she'd never have this view again. So she walked farther out than the beach usually allowed, stepping carefully over exposed rocks and kelp, and that's when she saw the shape half buried in the sand. At first she thought it was a seal pup. The size was right, maybe 2 feet long, sleek and pale. But when she got closer, the proportions were wrong. The head was too large. The limbs, if that's what they were, weren't flippers. And the texture of the skin wasn't fur or blubber, but something translucent, something that showed the fine architecture of veins and the slow pulse of something vital, still functioning. It wasn't breathing air. It was trying to, and failing. She knelt beside it. She didn't touch it yet. She watched the rapid flutter of gills along what she assumed was its neck, watched the mouth open and close with a rhythm that seemed practiced but increasingly weak. The eyes were closed, or it didn't have eyes in any configuration she recognized. She looked up and down the beach. Empty. Dawn on a Tuesday in March. No one else walked this early. The tide was already starting to turn. She could see the waterline beginning its slow reclaim, the first thin sheet of ocean sliding back across the exposed sand. In 30 minutes, the creature would be underwater again, if it survived that long. In its current state, she didn't think it would. She made the decision in less than 10 seconds. She pulled off her windbreaker, wrapped the creature as carefully as she could, and started walking back toward her house. It was heavier than it looked, dense in the way marine animals are dense, and it moved slightly against her chest, a weak spasm that might have been distress, or might have been the last of its strength leaving. She didn't call anyone, not then, not later, because even in those first 10 seconds of contact, she knew with absolute certainty that what she was carrying home wasn't something that could be explained. And she knew, though she wouldn't admit it for 3 more days, that she was already planning to keep it. Elena had 7 years of experience as a marine education coordinator at the Seattle Aquarium before budget cuts eliminated her position. She wasn't a scientist, but she knew anatomy, she knew taxonomy, she knew how to look at an unfamiliar creature and trace it backward through evolutionary relationships until it made sense. Nothing about the creature made sense. She laid it in the bathtub still wrapped in her windbreaker, then filled the tub with 6 inches of cold water. Seawater would have been better, but she didn't have time. Tap water wasn't ideal for most marine life, the chlorine, the different mineral content, but it was better than suffocation. She'd adjust from there. The creature didn't respond when the water covered it. For 30 seconds, Elena thought she'd been too late, that it had died during the walk home. Then the gills fluttered. Once, then twice, then a sustained rhythm. The mouth stopped its panicked opening and closing. The body remained still, but the stillness felt different now. Purposeful instead of limp. She sat on the bathroom floor and looked at what she'd brought into her house. In water, its form clarified. The translucence that had seemed like near death in the sand was apparently normal. She could see the skeletal structure beneath the skin, delicate and complex, more bones than seemed necessary. The skull was proportionally large, dominating the upper third of the body with a pronounced dome that suggested significant brain capacity. What she'd thought were gills along the neck were gills. 4 sets, feathered and crimson, flexing rhythmically now that water moved across them. The torso was narrow, almost emaciated, with a visible rib cage and a diaphragm-like muscle that contracted separately from the gills. Dual respiratory systems. That alone was unusual. That alone was impossible in any vertebrate she knew. The limbs were the worst part, 4 of them. The upper pair emerged from where shoulders should be, articulated through what looked like a collarbone structure, ending in hands. Not fins, not flippers, hands. 5 digits each, webbed partway down their length with tiny translucent claws at the tips. The lower pair were less developed, curled against the torso, but she could see the same digit structure, the same joint configuration. It had elbows. It had wrists. The lower body tapered into something more fish-like, a muscular tail with a delicate translucent fluke, veins visible through the membrane. But the tail attached to a pelvis. She could see the bone structure, and below the pelvis, vestigial hip joints where those smaller, lower limbs connected. Convergent evolution could explain some of this. Dolphins and fish look similar because water shapes bodies toward optimal forms. But this wasn't convergence. This was combination. This was a blueprint that incorporated mammalian skeletal structure, amphibian respiratory systems, and fish propulsion into a single organism. Elena had a biology degree. She'd spent 7 years explaining marine life to school groups, and she was looking at something that couldn't exist according to every developmental pathway she'd been taught. She watched it breathe for 20 minutes before she moved again. The face was the part she couldn't stop returning to. It had features. Not human features, but an arrangement that suggested similar social evolution. The eyes, still closed, were large and positioned frontally. Predator placement, depth perception. The nose was minimal, just 2 slits that occasionally flared. The mouth was small, almost delicate, with a lipless opening that revealed nothing about what might be inside. And the skin across the skull had a pattern. Faint, almost invisible, but definite. Chromatophores, maybe, like cephalopods have, or something else. A mottling that looked intentional, that looked like it might shift or signal or express something when the creature was healthy. She reached out slowly and touched its shoulder with one fingertip. The skin was cool and slightly tacky, like touching a mushroom cap. The texture had grain to it, microscopic scales or dermal denticles that caught at her fingerprint. The creature didn't react. She pressed slightly harder, feeling the bone beneath, the solid architecture of a functioning skeleton. She pulled her hand back. This was when she should have called someone, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a university marine lab, someone with authority and equipment and protocols for unknown species. This was when any responsible person with her training would have documented what she'd found and turned it over to people who could study it properly. She didn't even consider it. Because she'd seen what happened when unusual creatures were discovered. She'd worked in aquariums. She knew the difference between conservation and exhibition. And she knew with absolute certainty that if she called anyone, this creature would spend the rest of its brief life in a tank, while people took samples and wrote papers and speculated if it even survived that long. Most creatures this young and this fragile didn't adapt to captivity. The stress alone killed them. She told herself she'd keep it alive first. Then she'd decide what to do. The first lie is always the easiest. She spent the next 3 hours adjusting the water. She added aquarium salt in careful increments, testing the salinity with a kit she'd kept from her aquarium days. She raised the temperature slowly, using a submersible heater she'd bought for the fish tank she'd never set up after the divorce. She created a current with a small pump, angling it so the water moved across the creature's gills without buffeting it directly. By noon, the creature had opened its eyes. They were black, completely black, no visible pupil or iris distinction, just smooth obsidian surfaces that reflected the bathroom light. And they tracked her. Not randomly, not with the unfocused gaze of a concussed animal. They followed her movements with clear intent, watching as she adjusted equipment, As she leaned over the tub, as she backed away, it was watching her watch it. Elena sat down on the closed toilet lid and met that gaze for a long time. Marine biologists will tell you that intelligence is difficult to define and easy to project. People see intention in dolphin smiles, wisdom in sea turtle eyes, malice in shark behavior. Most of it is anthropomorphization. Most of it is humans inventing meaning where only instinct exists. But there are markers: problem solving, tool use, social learning, theory of mind, the ability to understand that other beings have separate thoughts and perspectives. The creature in her bathtub held her gaze without blinking, without fear, with something that felt like assessment. It was learning about her. It was deciding something. She felt the weight of that decision like cold water in her lungs. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quietly. The creature's mouth opened slightly. The gills fluttered faster. And Elena could have sworn, though she knew it was impossible, that it was testing whether she meant it. "I'm 62 years old, and I kept a mermaid hatchling alive in my bathtub for 3 days before its colony came to retrieve it. My name is Dr. Lee Caro. I was a marine veterinarian for 34 years. I've treated seals, dolphins, sea turtles, even a stranded orca calf once. I know how to keep something alive when it shouldn't be. I know the signs of recovery and the signs of decline. I know what intelligence looks like in the eyes of a marine animal. This was different. The first 6 hours were instinct. I filled the tub with seawater I hauled up from the beach in every container I had: buckets, storage bins, a cooler, 14 trips. The water had to be cold, close to 58 degrees. I don't have a thermometer that reads that low, so I used my meat thermometer. I monitored the temperature every 20 minutes for the first 4 hours, added ice when it climbed above 60. The creature had been hypothermic when I found it, but shock can kill through temperature swing just as easily as through exposure. It lay in the bottom of the tub for the first hour without moving. I thought I'd been too late. Then I saw the gill slits on its neck flutter, 3 on each side, translucent tissue edged in something darker. They opened and closed, not rhythmically, struggling, like watching someone try to remember how to breathe. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the creature had moved to the other end of the tub. Not much, maybe 8 inches. But deliberate. Its eyes were open. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time in good light. Not fish eyes, not seal eyes. The pupils were vertical slits like a cat's, but the iris was too complex, layers of color that shifted depending on angle, gray-green near the pupil, darker blue at the edges, with something metallic running through it. And they tracked me when I moved. I'd been watched by plenty of intelligent animals, seals, dolphins, octopi. You learn to recognize awareness. This was awareness. But there was something else under it. Calculation, maybe. Evaluation. I moved to the left side of the bathroom. The eyes followed. I moved to the right. They followed. I crouched down to eye level. It blinked. Not the way fish blink. They have nictitating membranes that slide across horizontally. This was a full lid closure, top and bottom, human style. It blinked, held my gaze for 3 seconds, then looked deliberately at the faucet. I turned the water on, just a trickle, cold. The creature moved again, faster this time, positioning itself under the stream. The water ran over its head, down its back. The gill slits opened wider. I watched the tissue inside them turn from grayish pink to darker red. Oxygenation. It stayed there for 11 minutes. When I turned the faucet off, it returned to the center of the tub and settled on its side, the way a seal might. That's when I noticed the fingers. I'd been so focused on keeping it alive, I hadn't properly examined the anatomy. The forelimbs were somewhere between a seal's flippers and a human infant's arms. There was an elbow joint, definitely. And the hands, 4 fingers, webbed to the first knuckle, but fully articulated. It curled them against its chest the way a sleeping child would. There were nails, translucent, but shaped like human fingernails, not claws. The lower body was more straightforward, a tail, single-fluked like a cetacean's, but proportioned differently, longer, more muscular even in infancy. The skin was smooth, not scaled, but there were patterns along the sides, darker streaks that might have been pigmentation or might have been something structural under the skin. I couldn't tell without touching, and I didn't touch. Some instinct told me not to. It slept most of the first day. I changed half the water twice, temperature matching each batch. I dissolved a small amount of electrolyte powder in the second evening change, the kind we use for marine mammal rehydration. It didn't react poorly. By the second morning, the breathing looked easier. That afternoon, it ate. I'd been offering food since hour 12, pieces of raw fish, mackerel first, then squid. It ignored them for a full day. Then, around 2 in the afternoon on day 2, it lifted its head and looked directly at the piece of squid I'd just dropped in. It didn't lunge. It moved through the water with precision I haven't seen in any marine animal that small. One hand reached out. The fingers closed around the squid. It brought the food to its mouth and bit down. I saw teeth, small, white, sharp at the canines, and I saw it chew, not tear, chew, with molars. It ate 3 more pieces over the next hour. After the 4th, it lifted itself partially out of the water, using both arms braced against the side of the tub, and looked at me. The position was unnatural for any aquatic animal. It held itself there for nearly a minute, water streaming off its back, and we stared at each other. I made a sound, not words, just a low, soft sound, the kind you make to an injured animal to show you're not a threat. It tilted its head, the way a dog does when processing something unfamiliar. Then it made a sound back, high-pitched, melodic, but structured. Not a cry, not a whistle, something between the two. It had syllables, 3 distinct notes in sequence. It repeated them twice, watching me the entire time. I should have been afraid. I wasn't. I was mesmerized. By the 3rd day, the creature was moving constantly. It swam laps in the tub, as much as you can swim in 5 feet of water. It pulled itself upright to look over the edge. It reached for things I held out, not food, objects, a washcloth, a plastic cup. It examined them with its hands, turning them, bringing them close to its face. Then it returned them, set them down carefully on the side of the tub, not dropped, not thrown, placed. I started talking to it. Not because I thought it would understand, because the silence felt wrong. I told it what I was doing when I changed the water. I told it the temperature. I told it when I was leaving the room. And every time I spoke, it stopped moving and watched my mouth. That evening, the 3rd evening, I sat on the bathroom floor with my back against the wall. The creature had been active all day, and I thought it would rest. Instead, it positioned itself at the end of the tub, nearest to me. We sat there for maybe 20 minutes. It didn't make a sound. Neither did I. Then I heard something outside, not close, distant, from the direction of the ocean, maybe a half-mile off, a sound I'd never heard before, low and resonant, carrying over the water. It repeated 3 times, 3 long pulses, rhythmic. The creature in my bathtub went rigid. Its head snapped toward the bathroom window. The gill slits opened fully, and it made a sound, louder than before, sharper. The same 3-note sequence it had made earlier, but urgent now, almost frantic. I stood, walked to the window. The ocean was dark. The tide was coming in, but it was early. Not for another 2 hours, according to the chart I'd checked that morning. But the water was already higher than it should be. I could see it reaching past the high tide line, and there were shapes moving in the surf, too large to be seals, too coordinated to be debris. I looked back at the creature. It was watching me, not the window, me. And I understood for the first time that I had not rescued anything. I had taken something, and they had known exactly where it was the entire time. There are 327 documented cultural traditions worldwide that reference merfolk young. I counted. After that third night, I spent 6 weeks compiling every academic source, every ethnographic record, every translated oral history I could access. I needed to know if anyone else had done what I'd done. I needed to know what happened to them. The answer is, most didn't survive to record it. Start with the Orkney Islands, 1890. A fisherman named Malcolm Grieve found what he described as a sea bairn in a tidal pool after a storm. He brought it home in a basket. His wife made a bed for it in their wash tub. They fed it scraps of herring and kept it warm by the stove. For 4 days it grew stronger. On the 5th morning, the entire village woke to find the harbor filled with selkies, dozens of them, arranged in rows, silent and motionless. The Grieves returned the creature to the water at dawn. The selkies left. Malcolm Grieve's boat never had an empty net again for the rest of his life, but he never spoke about those 4 days to anyone outside his family. His grandson recorded the account in 1954. The pattern repeats. Japan, 1920s. A Ningyo, fish person, washed ashore near Toba. A fisherman's daughter, age 17, kept it in a wooden trough for 3 days, feeding it rice and small fish. On the 3rd night, her father woke to find the entire beach covered in Ningyo, motionless, waiting. They returned the young one at first light. The family was spared, but the girl reported dreams of deep water for the rest of her life. She never married. She moved inland and refused to approach the ocean again. West Africa, oral tradition recorded in the 1970s. Mamiwata, water spirits, are said to sometimes leave their young in river shallows during seasonal flooding. The stories are consistent. If a human finds one and cares for it properly, the Mamiwata will retrieve it without violence. But proper care is specific. Fresh water changed twice daily. No salt, no iron near the water, no speaking of the discovery to others. And the human must not look directly at the Mamiwata when they come to collect. Those who violated the rules were found drowned in ankle-deep water. I had violated at least 2 of those rules without knowing they existed. The academic literature tries to rationalize it. Misidentified seals, deformed porpoises, mass hysteria, shared cultural anxiety about the ocean. But the details are too consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. The descriptions match, the behavior matches, and the consequences match. There's a paper from 1967 published in a French anthropological journal that no one cites anymore. The author, Dr. Simone Vesque, spent 11 years collecting first-hand accounts of marine humanoid contact events from coastal communities in Brittany, Polynesia, and Newfoundland. She documented 47 cases where individuals claimed to have encountered juvenile merfolk. Of those 47, 34 involved some form of retrieval event. 19 of those retrievals involved direct contact between humans and adult merfolk. Vesca noted that survivors of contact incidents reported similar after effects: night terrors involving drowning, persistent sense of being observed, and an inability to live more than a few miles from coastline. She called it thalassic imprinting. The paper was rejected from 3 major journals before a minor publication accepted it. Vesque never published again. She died in 1973, drowning in her bathtub. I found her paper in a university archive 3 weeks after the retrieval. I read it twice. Then I locked my doors and didn't leave my house for 4 days. The folklore is not superstition. It's a record, a warning system. Coastal communities knew things that inland academics dismissed because they had to live with the consequences of ignorance. They knew the sea was inhabited by something intelligent. They knew that intelligence had rules, boundaries, and consequences. They knew that young were left in specific places under specific conditions. And they knew that taking one, even with good intentions, created a debt. The Celtic traditions are the most explicit. Selkies and Merrows, Irish merfolk, both feature prominently in stories about abandoned young. The pattern is always the same. The young are left temporarily, never permanently. They're left in locations that seem dangerous, exposed tidal pools, storm-damaged shallows, but the exposure is deliberate, a test maybe, or a necessary stage of development. The adults remain nearby, always. They watch. And if a human interferes, the response depends on intent and treatment. Care and return, rewarded. Harm or captivity, retribution. The Scottish ballads are more specific about timeline. 3 days appears again and again. The child ballad 113, The Great Silkie of Sule Skerry, references a 3-day threshold. Other fragments mention 3 tides, 3 nights, 3 visits, as if the number itself has significance, as if they're waiting to see what the human will do. Testing, whether the finder is keeper or killer. I kept the creature for 3 days. I didn't know I was being tested. I didn't know the 3 days weren't about the hatchling's recovery. They were about mine. About whether I could be trusted, whether I would try to keep it, whether I would harm it or call authorities or do any of the things that would require a different kind of response. I passed. Barely. There's a Greek account from the 4th century BCE, recorded by Plutarch, about Nereid young found on beaches after storms. He writes that the Nereids would leave their weakest offspring in tidal zones deliberately as a form of selection. Those strong enough to survive exposure would be retrieved. Those too weak would be left. But humans who interfered disrupted the process and invited the gaze of the deep mothers whose love was as fierce as their vengeance. Plutarch noted that entire coastal villages could be abandoned after a single incident of mishandled Nereid young. I thought about that, about whether the hatchling I found was meant to survive, whether I had disrupted something, whether my interference had been help or harm. The Maori traditions offer a different perspective. The Taniwa, water guardians, sometimes place their young in estuaries and lagoons deliberately as a way of marking territory or establishing relationship with the land. Caring for Taniwa young is considered an honor, but also a responsibility that binds families for generations. There are iwi tribes who trace their lineage to ancestors who cared for Taniwa young and were marked as kin. They report ongoing contact, sightings, protection during ocean travel. The bond doesn't end with retrieval. It's permanent. I didn't want permanent. I wanted to forget. I wanted the 3 days to be an aberration, a strange incident I could file away and never think about again. But the folklore suggested that wasn't an option, that the moment I pulled the hatchling from the sand, something changed. A boundary was crossed. A relationship was initiated, whether I wanted it or not. The Inuit have stories about kalupalik, human-like sea dwellers who take children. But there's a lesser-known variant, stories about humans who care for kalupalik young and are afterward considered sea-touched. They're not taken. They're marked. They see things others don't. They hear things others can't. They live between worlds, never fully belonging to land again. I started noticing things after that 3rd night. Patterns in the waves I hadn't seen before, shapes in the water at dusk, sounds that might have been wind but carried structure, rhythm, intentionality. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or finally seeing clearly. The folklore says both are true. I'm 53 years old. I've lived on this stretch of coast for 30 years. I know what the ocean sounds like at night. I know the difference between storm surge and spring tide, between wind chop and trawler wake. I know when the water is behaving the way it should. On the first night after I brought the hatchling home, the water stopped behaving. It started small, things I noticed but didn't connect. The woman, her name was Claire Osborne, we'll call her that, kept a record during those 3 days. Not detailed, just notes on her phone, time-stamped observations about the creature's condition. But between those clinical entries about respiration and movement, there are other notes. Environmental observations, things that bothered her enough to document, but not enough to make her stop. First night, 11:47 p.m. Tide sounds wrong. too loud for current phase. She checked the tide charts that night. She had them pulled up on her laptop when she wrote that note. The tide was supposed to be moderate, midway between high and low. Nothing dramatic. But from her house, set back 200 yards from the waterline, she could hear it. The sound of water moving in volume. She went to the window, looked out at the beach. In the moonlight, she could see the foam line, the place where the waves were reaching. It was higher than it should have been, not dramatically. Maybe 15 feet higher than the chart predicted. Close enough to dismiss as weather variation, wind pushing water. A passing squall she hadn't noticed, except there was no wind. Second night, 1:23 a.m. Heard something? Not sure what. She described it later, this is from the interview conducted after, as a sound that didn't fit the catalog of coastal night sounds she'd internalized over 3 decades. Not mechanical, not weather. Organic, maybe. A vocalization. Low frequency, traveling far, the kind of sound whales make, but shorter, more structured. She heard it 3 times that night, spaced roughly 40 minutes apart. Each time it seemed to come from a different location along the coastline. South, then north, then directly offshore. At the time she thought maybe it was boats. Sound carries strangely over water at night. Could have been fishing vessels signaling each other, could have been a dozen things. Except the harbor was empty. She checked the next morning, talked to the harbor master about whether there'd been unusual traffic the night before. He told her the fishing fleet had been in port due to equipment inspections. Nothing out that night. What's documented, what marine biologists have recorded extensively, is that cetaceans and pinnipeds use coordinated calling patterns when searching for separated pod members. They space out, cover more area. They call in sequence so they can differentiate their own voices from each other, triangulating possible locations through echo and response. Claire didn't know that then. Second night, 3:15 a.m. Tide still wrong, higher. She went outside this time, walked down to the beach in her coat and boots. The creature was in her house, in the saltwater bath she'd prepared, growing stronger. She'd watched it move more deliberately that evening. It had looked at her with something she couldn't call anything but recognition. The tide was wrong. She knew the moon phase. She knew what the water should be doing, and it was reaching 40 feet higher than predicted now. The foam line was up near the dune grass, close to where she'd found the hatchling 2 days before. But the ocean wasn't violent, wasn't storming. It was calm, just higher, as if something had added volume without adding force. Claire stood on the beach for 20 minutes, listening, watching. She told the interviewer later that she felt observed. She used that exact word, not watched, observed. The way you feel when you're part of an experiment and you've just realized the study is about you. She heard the sound again while she stood there. Closer this time. Definitely offshore, but near. She couldn't see anything in the dark water. No shapes, no movement. Just the slow rise and fall of swells that shouldn't have been that high. Third day, morning. Birds are wrong. She noticed it when she went out to check the beach at dawn. The seabirds, gulls, terns, pelicans weren't where they usually were. Normally her section of coast had heavy bird traffic, feeding patterns, roosting sites. She'd grown used to the noise, the constant presence. That morning the beach was silent. The birds were there. She could see them, but they'd moved. Congregated further down the shore, at least half a mile south. They weren't feeding, they were just gathered, staying away from the stretch of beach directly in front of her house. Animal behavior research has documented this, avoidance patterns. When predators or unusual phenomena occupy a zone, wildlife redistributes. They don't stay. They adjust their territories. The absence of animals isn't always about danger. Sometimes it's about something else being present, something that takes priority. Claire stood on the empty beach and looked at the water. Flat. Calm. Still too high. Third day, 2 p.m., checking charts again. Tide wrong every measurement. She spent an hour that afternoon cross-referencing tidal prediction tables, NOAA data, weather service reports. Nothing explained it. No storm systems, no seismic activity, no atmospheric pressure changes. The tide was simply higher than physics said it should be, and it had been rising incrementally since the night she brought the hatchling home. She didn't connect it yet, not consciously. Third night, 9:38 p.m. It knows. It's waiting for something. The creature had changed by then, stronger, more alert. It watched the windows now, turned its head toward the ocean even though it couldn't see it from where she'd placed the bath. She noticed it was making sounds, soft, high frequency. Nothing she could properly hear, more like she felt them in her sinuses behind her eyes. In cetacean research, separated calves make distress calls, specific vocalizations that carry farther than normal communication. They broadcast their location. But they also listen. They wait for the pod's response before calling again. The hatchling wasn't calling constantly. It was calling and listening, patterned, deliberate. Claire sat next to the bath and watched it watch the wall, the direction of the ocean. She didn't write anything else that night. Later, she said she'd started to understand that the 3 days hadn't been about the creature recovering. They'd been about something else arriving. Third night, 11:55 p.m. Water wrong again, worse. The sound woke her. Not the vocalizations, the water itself, the volume. She got up and looked out the window, and the tide was higher than she'd ever seen it in 30 years, higher than hurricane surges, higher than king tides. The water had reached the dune grass and was still coming, but there was no storm. The ocean was glass flat, almost luminous in the moonlight, just rising, impossible and methodical. She went downstairs. The hatchling was agitated now, moving in the bath with strength it hadn't shown before, making sounds that weren't distress anymore, something else, anticipation maybe. Claire stood in her living room and listened to the water come closer and understood that she'd been allowed 3 days. Not by accident, not by chance. Something had known exactly where its hatchling was since the moment she'd picked it up. Something had watched her take it, watched her care for it. Something had waited for the conditions to be right, for the tide, for the moon, for whatever other factors mattered to a species humans didn't have names for. The 3 days hadn't been a countdown for the creature to heal. They'd been a countdown for the colony to arrive. Marine biologists have documented strategic patience in cetaceans. Orcas will wait hours for seals to enter the water. Humpback whales coordinate hunting patterns across miles of ocean. Dolphins problem solve in real time, adjusting tactics based on observed results, but those are instinct overlaid with intelligence, learned behavior, evolutionary adaptation. What Claire experienced wasn't that. The pattern suggests something else: deliberate observation, assessment, a waiting period that served a purpose beyond simple retrieval logistics. The colony, whatever came ashore on the third night, had known where the hatchling was from the moment she found it. The evidence makes that clear. But they waited. We need to understand what that means. There are recorded cases of marine mammals tracking separated young across distances that seem impossible. A gray whale calf separated from its mother in Baja California was retrieved 600 miles north after 11 days. The mother had followed, consistently, methodically, waiting for the calf to reach waters deep enough for safe reunion. Elephant seals have been documented returning to exact beach locations where pups were last seen, sometimes weeks after separation. They search, they call, they don't give up. The tracking itself isn't mysterious. Echolocation, scent in water, vocalization patterns. Marine animals have sensory tools humans barely understand. A pod of whales can locate a specific individual across an ocean. A mother seal knows her pup's voice in a colony of thousands. So the colony knowing where their hatchling was isn't the strange part. The waiting is. Claire's house was 200 yards from the water. The hatchling was alive, getting stronger, making vocalizations that could have been heard underwater. High-frequency sounds travel efficiently through both air and sea. Any parent animal, any protective pod, would have known the offspring was alive and would have moved immediately to retrieve it, especially something intelligent enough to be called a colony, to coordinate, to search in patterns. But they waited 3 days. Weather wasn't a factor. Those 3 days were calm. No storms, no dangerous surf. The tide was accessible every 12 hours. If retrieval was the only goal, they could have come the first night. They didn't. There's a framework in animal behavior research called human assessment. It's documented in wild animals that have learned to coexist with human presence. Crows, for instance, will test humans, drop objects, observe reactions. They're determining threat level, measuring whether this particular human is dangerous or useful or irrelevant. Dolphins in areas with heavy human activity have been observed approaching swimmers selectively, not randomly. They choose who to interact with based on criteria researchers still don't fully understand. Behavior maybe, body language, some quality that suggests safety or compatibility. The waiting period makes sense if the colony wasn't just tracking their hatchling, if they were tracking Claire. She'd taken their offspring. That's an act that requires interpretation. In most species, it would be considered predation or theft, immediate threat, immediate response. But if the species is intelligent enough to recognize nuance, to distinguish between aggression and something else, then observation becomes logical. They watched what she did. She brought it home, prepared salt water, maintained temperature. The hatchling was visible through windows. Its condition could be monitored. She wasn't hiding it away, wasn't harming it. She checked it constantly, adjusted its environment. She was anxious, careful. She was caring for it. That's the detail that changes everything. In Christopher Columbus's journal from 1493, there's a passage about 3 mermaids he claimed to see off the coast of Hispaniola. He described them as watching the ships, not fleeing, not approaching, watching. He wrote that they seemed to be taking measure of the men. In 1679, in Leganés, Spain, a young man reportedly disappeared into the sea and reappeared 5 years later with physical changes, webbed fingers, scaled skin. The reports say he was found by fishermen and brought back to land. But the fishermen noted something strange. Before they caught him, they'd seen others like him in the water, watching. Multiple individuals. The reports say they didn't interfere with the capture, but they followed the boat back to shore. They stayed just offshore for 3 days before disappearing. 3 days. In the K Islands, Indonesian folklore describes orang ikan, fish people. The stories include specific warnings. If you find one of their young, you care for it. You don't harm it. You don't hide it. You leave it visible. You wait. The elders will come. They'll observe you. If you've treated the young one well, they let you return it. If you haven't, the stories don't specify what happens then. The pattern repeats across centuries, across oceans, unconnected cultures with identical narrative structures, abandoned young, human intervention, observation period, then retrieval, always on the colony's terms. Claire didn't know these stories. Most people don't. Mermaid folklore is treated as fantasy now, entertainment, but the consistent elements across that folklore suggest something else, not proof, we're careful about that word, but pattern, repetition. The kind of narrative consistency that appears when stories are rooted in repeated experience rather than invention. The colony waited because they were testing her. By the 3rd night, they had their answer. She'd kept the hatchling alive. She'd maintained its environment. She'd touched it gently. She'd watched it with something that, if they could interpret human expression, might have looked like concern, like protection. She'd passed. On the 3rd night, the conditions aligned, moon phase, tide, whatever other factors mattered. The water rose to meet the land. The colony came ashore, not to attack, not to punish, to retrieve what was theirs from someone who'd proven she could be trusted not to harm it. Claire told the interviewer later that the intelligence was unmistakable. The coordination, the patience, the way they'd waited for her to understand what was happening before they made contact. She said it wasn't like encountering an animal. It was like encountering a culture, a society, something organized and deliberate and capable of strategic thought. She said she'd never felt so evaluated in her life. Marine intelligence research has its limits. We study what we can observe: whales, dolphins, octopi. We document tool use, problem solving, communication complexity. We're constantly revising upward our estimates of what ocean-dwelling creatures are capable of. But we study known animals, cataloged species. What came for the hatchling on the third night wasn't in any catalog. The waiting period wasn't about tides or weather or physical capability. It was about judgment, about determining whether the human who'd interfered could be allowed to live with the knowledge of what she'd seen. They gave her 3 days to prove she wasn't a threat. And then they came to take back what was theirs. The tide should not have risen that high. She checked the charts later, went back through the marine data for that week. Spring tide was 10 days out. No storm system within 500 miles. Moon phase wrong. Every predictive model said the water should have stayed exactly where it belonged, 40 yards from her back deck, contained within its normal margins. Instead, it came within 6 feet of her door. She woke to the sound at 2:47 a.m. Not waves. Waves have rhythm pattern, the mechanical repetition of physics. This was deliberate, purposeful. The sound of something large moving through shallow water with careful precision, the displacement intentional rather than incidental. The hatchling was already awake. She'd kept it in the converted aquarium tank near the window, had been monitoring its respiration, its alertness, the steady improvement in its condition. For 3 days it had been passive, accepting food, allowing her proximity, watching her with those unsettling dark eyes that tracked movement with too much comprehension. Now it was pressed against the glass facing the ocean. She approached the window. The exterior lights were motion-activated, had triggered automatically. What they illuminated made her stop breathing. There were 7 of them in the shallow water. Full-grown, nearly 6 feet in length, their bodies built for deep water speed but moving through the flooded yard with disturbing ease. Their heads broke the surface in perfect synchronization. 7 pairs of eyes, reflecting the light, back with that same unblinking intensity she'd been studying for 3 days. They weren't searching, they were waiting. She understood then with perfect clarity that they'd known exactly where the hatchling was from the moment she'd carried it from the beach. 3 days, 72 hours. Not recovery time for the creature in her care, countdown for whatever they'd been waiting to complete. The largest one moved forward. The others maintained their positions, equidistant, forming a geometric pattern she recognized from somewhere. Some article about predator coordination, pack hunting strategies in species with high social intelligence. The hatchling made a sound. She'd never heard it vocalized before. High-pitched, brief, nothing she could compare to any marine mammal call in her reference memory. The adult answered with something lower, more complex. Not language, she told herself. Sophisticated communication, but not language. The third vocalization came from her left. She hadn't seen the one that had circled the house, approaching from the blind side, cutting off the inland exit route with the same strategic placement the others maintained seaward. 8 total, coordinated positions, planned approach. They'd waited for the anomalous tide, something they'd either predicted with senses humans didn't possess or somehow caused through methods she had no framework to consider. She made the decision in seconds. The hatchling belonged with them. She'd known that from the beginning, had been telling herself she was waiting for it to stabilize, to heal, but really she'd been delaying the inevitable because the alternative, acknowledging what she'd actually found, required accepting implications she'd been avoiding. She lifted the tank. The hatchling weighed almost nothing, its body density adapted for buoyancy, constructed from biology that made sense only for deep water pressure and three-dimensional movement through liquid medium. The back door stuck slightly. She hadn't opened it in weeks, rarely used it. The sound was too loud in the silence, but the adults didn't react. They waited with that same terrible patience they'd apparently maintained for 3 consecutive days and nights. She carried the tank down the 3 wooden steps to the flooded yard. The water was cold, mid-50s, too cold for the season. It reached her knees. The adults maintained their distance, watching her with focus that made her hands shake. She set the tank into the water. The hatchling emerged immediately, moving with strength it hadn't shown inside, transitioning into the ocean with fluid efficiency that revealed how limited it had been by captivity, how much it had been tolerating her care rather than requiring it. The largest adult moved forward. What happened next took 4 seconds. She counted afterward, checking her watch, establishing timeline documentation with the same methodical precision that had defined her career, as though clinical detail could make the impossible measurable. The adult examined the hatchling. Physical contact, brief. Checking for injury or alteration, she assumed. Confirming identity, perhaps. The hatchling responded with that same vocalization, more complex this time, sustained. Communication occurring at registers and with content she had no ability to interpret. Then the large one turned back toward her. They made eye contact, 3 feet apart. Close enough that she could see the membrane that slid sideways across its eye, the gill structures that flexed rhythmically behind its jaw, the webbing between fingers that extended well beyond human proportions. Close enough that there was no ambiguity, no room for misidentification or rationalization. It raised one hand, held it there, palm outward, maintained position for a count of 3, then it dropped below the surface. The others followed in sequence. The hatchling went last, glancing back once before it submerged, and then there was nothing but the abnormal tide and the disrupted water and the absolute certainty that what had just occurred was not retrieval. It was acknowledgement. She didn't report it. The decision was immediate and required no deliberation. What would she have said? To whom? The Coast Guard, to explain that an unknown species had performed a coordinated nighttime extraction of a juvenile she'd been keeping illegally in her home. Wildlife Services to document that something they didn't recognize as existing had demonstrated strategic planning and symbolic communication. The University Marine Biology Department, where she'd taught for 12 years before early retirement, so former colleagues could process her describing behavior that required cognitive capacity no accepted marine animal possessed? She filed no documentation, kept no samples, she'd never taken any, some instinct warning her from the beginning that physical evidence would create complications she wasn't prepared to navigate. The tank was cleaned, returned to storage, the backyard showed flooding, but the tide had been anomalous. Her neighbors, 2 houses down, also reported water damage. Insurance covered it. What remained was the knowledge and the permanent alteration of everything that followed. The dreams started within a week, not nightmares. That word implied threat, fear, the psyche processing trauma. These were something else. She was underwater in them, moving through depth that should have crushed her, breathing through some adaptation she didn't question within the dream logic. There were others present. Not the same individuals, she thought not, though identification was uncertain, but the same species moving through their environment with purpose, going about whatever their existence entailed. She woke from these dreams without distress. That was the strange part. She woke calm, rested. Sometimes with the sense that she'd been taught something, shown something, though the specific content evaporated on waking. The ocean sounded different. She noticed it the first time she returned to the beach 3 weeks after the retrieval. Walking the same stretch where she'd found the hatchling, she realized the wave patterns registered differently, carried information she was suddenly attuned to: temperature shifts, current variations, the acoustic signature of different weather systems approaching from offshore. Nothing mystical, just sensitivity she hadn't possessed before, awareness that had somehow transferred through proximity or intention. Seals approached her. That was documented, confirmable. Multiple occasions, witnesses present. She'd walk the waterline and harbor seals would surface, track her movement, occasionally follow her for 30 or 40 yards before returning to their previous behavior. This wasn't normal. Seals habituated to human presence became indifferent, not actively interested. These watched her specifically, ignored other beachgoers. Once, a whale, gray whale, juvenile, close enough to shore that other observers commented on it, took photos. It surfaced directly parallel to where she stood on the rocks, maintained position for close to a minute. She felt the examination, the same quality of focused attention the adults had demonstrated that night. Then it continued north, migration route, completely explainable, except it had stopped. For her. She knew that with the same certainty she knew her own name. She told no one. But the isolation of the knowledge changed her. She'd lived alone since the divorce, preferred it that way, had built a careful life around solitude and routine. This was different. This was carrying information that redefined fundamental reality, watching others operate within comfortable assumptions about what the ocean contained while knowing they were wrong in ways that would terrify them. The marking, if that's what it was, came with no instructions, no further contact, just the ongoing sense of being known, recognized, tracked by something that moved through a parallel existence most humans never glimpsed. She researched afterward, carefully, found patterns she hadn't been looking for, indigenous accounts from Pacific Northwest tribes describing individuals who'd helped see people and afterward carried protection, or sometimes obligation. Scottish island folklore about those who'd shown kindness to Selkies and ever after were considered kin, granted safe passage, but expected to keep the secret. Caribbean stories of fishermen who'd released trapped merfolk and spent the rest of their lives with unusual luck at sea and recurring dreams of depth. The common elements: selection wasn't random. The contact occurred during liminal conditions, tide changes, storms, threshold moments. The aftermath involved permanent alteration in how the ocean responded to the individual, and always the emphasis on silence. Those who spoke openly faced ridicule, or worse. Those who kept the knowledge carried it like a second life, invisible to everyone around them. She tried once to discuss it obliquely. A former colleague, someone she'd trusted during her teaching years, she framed it as hypothetical, a thought experiment about paradigm shifts in marine biology, what it would mean to discover complex intelligence in an unclassified species. Her colleague laughed, said she'd retired at the right time if she was starting to believe in mermaids. The conversation ended. She never tried again. The hatchling would be growing. She thought about that sometimes, wondered what its maturation process looked like, how quickly they developed, what it might retain from those 3 days in captivity, whether it remembered her, whether memory functioned the same for them, or if experience was processed through completely alien cognitive architecture. She'd been chosen. That's what it had felt like when the adult raised its hand, acknowledged her before departing. Not threat, not warning, recognition. You've been seen. You're known now. Some doors, once opened, never fully close. She lived on the threshold now, standing between worlds, holding information that isolated her from her own species while marking her as visible to another. The ocean looked the same to everyone else, but she knew better now, knew what moved beneath the surface, what intelligence watched from depth, what patience they possessed, and what organizational complexity they maintained. She knew they placed their young deliberately and waited to see what humans would do, that the entire encounter had been test or trust or something with no human equivalent. And she knew that being chosen meant carrying the weight of that knowledge alone, because proof would require betrayal, and betrayal wasn't something she could live with. So she kept the secret, walked the beach, listened to the changed ocean, accepted the dreams, and waited, though for what she couldn't articulate, to see if acknowledgement was the end of contact or merely its beginning. She never reported what happened, not to authorities, not to researchers, not to anyone who might ask questions she couldn't answer. She's not unique in that silence. Coastal folklore worldwide contains a specific recurring motif, the changed person, someone who helped merfolk, encountered them, or crossed some invisible boundary between worlds. These stories describe individuals who afterward couldn't fully leave the shore, who understood tide patterns instinctively, who the ocean seemed to recognize. Modern cryptozoology dismisses these as superstition, but buried in unverified report databases are accounts that echo identical patterns, repeat witnesses, the same person reporting multiple sightings over years, always alone, always in the same stretch of coastline. Statistical clustering that shouldn't exist if sightings were random misidentification. Something selects certain people, or certain people stumble across boundaries most never approach. The woman from this account eventually moved inland, 30 miles from any coast. She reported constant dreams of water, a persistent sense she'd forgotten something crucial. 2 years later, she was back, living in a cottage within sight of the same beach. She won't discuss why she returned, only that the alternative felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. Other cases follow similar trajectories. A fisherman in Scotland who rescued what he described as a juvenile selkie found himself unable to take his boat beyond sight of that specific cove for the rest of his life. A Brazilian woman who pulled a small humanoid figure from tide pools spent the following decade walking that beach every dawn, though she insisted nothing further ever happened. The silence isn't fear, it's something closer to understanding, a recognition that some experiences create obligations or connections that operate outside normal frameworks. They waited 3 days. They came at night. They left her alive and aware. Those facts matter. They suggest intention, patience, and decision-making that extends beyond animal rescue instinct. The colony knew where their hatchling was. They watched her care for it. They chose when to retrieve it. Which leaves the question, was the hatchling genuinely abandoned or deliberately placed? Some encounters may be accidents, others may be tests or observations or something we don't have language for. The woman never saw them again. But she checks the tide every morning, watches the water differently now, understands she crossed into something that doesn't have clear boundaries or simple explanations. Somewhere tonight, someone else is walking a coastline at low tide. They'll find something half buried in sand, struggling to breathe, impossible to categorize. They'll bring it home. They'll tell no one. And in 3 days, something will come looking. The pattern continues, the boundary remains, and the ocean keeps its secrets, except for those it chooses to show.